Welcome to Hurt at Work, a Kentucky workers' comp podcast. Today, Louisville workers' compensation attorney Scott Scheynost is going to provide helpful information, tips, and advice for injured workers and their families. Scott's goal is to help you to maximize the benefits you receive. If working's got you hurting, sit back and listen to Scott address topics that matter to you. Friends, welcome back. We're excited to have two guests in the studio today. We do have attorney Scott Scheynost, but we also have Pat Roth, and we'll introduce Pat in just a minute. Hey, Scott, welcome back to the studio. Today we're going to talk about a pretty interesting concept here in the Kentucky workers' compensation world. It's called the Kentucky Uninsured Employers Fund, UEF. So welcome to the studio.
Glad to be back here, Jim. How you doing?
I'm doing well, buddy. This is a big deal. This UEF is a really big deal because basically it kicks in, as I understand it, when an employer doesn't have the workers' comp that the company is supposed to be carrying. Is that about right?
That's right. It's actually a pretty good benefit for the state of Kentucky. Other states like Indiana do not have this. But if your employer does not carry workers' compensation insurance, if you're injured at the job, you still have an avenue where you can receive those benefits. And what happens is the state of Kentucky has got a statutory scheme where they've created the Uninsured Employers Fund. And Pat used to work for them. I've got the pleasure of him coming in my office. I've known Pat for a long time. He's got a lot of experience with workers' compensation in Kentucky, specifically with the Uninsured Employers Fund. And I've actually had some cases with Pat in the past. But I think a lot of people are surprised to find out that they can still get workers' comp benefits even if their employer does not have workers' compensation insurance. And I've asked Pat to come in here today and talk a little bit about that. Talk about how it works, the system, how it works, maybe some of the cases that he's run across over in the past, and just give us a general idea. But again, a lot of people hear from their employer, I don't have workers' comp insurance. They don't think there's anything they're going to get out of this, but there's actually a way that you can get the exact same benefits that you would have gotten if your employer had insurance through the Uninsured Employers Fund. Now, Pat, I've known for a long time. He actually went to high school with me a long time ago. I don't think I want to admit that in public, but we went to law school together. We've both been practicing workers' compensation for a long time, longer than either one of us really want to admit. And Pat's retired from the state, the Uninsured Employers Fund, and I've asked him to come in and help me, and he's assisted me in my office and made my life a lot easier in a lot of different ways too, and I've enjoyed working with Pat. But again, he's got a special view on this because he's worked for this agency for a long time, and he knows how it works, and I've asked him to come in today to talk a little bit about it. Pat, you want to say hi to everybody?
Hello, everybody.
Why don't we get Pat? Just tell us a little bit about your background, kind of where you got started, and kind of your career, definitely at the UEF, but even before that, and then we'll kind of jump into some topics.
Well, I started in workers' comp law while I was still in law school. My very first and only clerkship was with a division of the state called the Special Fund. They were part of the Labor Cabinet, and they were one avenue of workers' compensation benefits. And so I started while I was still in law school before I became an attorney doing workers' comp. So I've got actually, I don't know how many years, 30-plus years in workers' comp and experience even before I graduated law school.
Was there something about the entire workers' comp area of law that just grabbed you or kind of interests you? I mean, it's kind of a unique area of law.
No, I just fell into it. A neighbor's mother worked for the division, had told me she could help me get a job, and I just backed into it. But I enjoyed it, and then once I graduated law school, I wound up going to work for that same division for 16 years.
Wow. And then you've retired. You've been retired for a couple of years now?
I retired 6 months before COVID hit, just a couple months before the election when Andy Beshear, who was my boss at the UEF there at the end, he was the Attorney General. My last 14 years with state government was with the Uninsured Employers Fund.
Wow.
Pat, you want to tell everybody a little bit about what the Uninsured Employers Fund is and what you did there?
Okay. The purpose of the Uninsured Employers Fund was the state wants to guarantee to any worker that gets injured in this state that they have an avenue for benefits even if the employer fails to have workers' comp insurance. There are some employers that just don't purchase it. They don't care.
Some people don't know they have to have it.
Yeah. Some of them don't know they have to have it. One of the avenues we would discover was that if a business only had one or two employees, they were under the mistaken impression that they didn't have to have workers' comp insurance. My understanding is in Tennessee you have to have 3 or more employees before you're required. But in Kentucky, even one part-time employee requires you to get workers' comp insurance. And if that business would explore the cost of the insurance, they probably find it was very minimal if you only have one part-time employee. But so that could be one avenue. Another avenue might be a business failed to make a payment. Just like anybody might miss a car payment, a business could miss a payment on a workers' comp policy. And so for a period of time, there might be no coverage. And if a worker got injured during that time, then the insurance company's not going to pay for it. So the avenue for that injured worker to get paid would be through the Uninsured Employers Fund.
What kind of benefits would be available to somebody through the Uninsured Employers Fund if their employer did not have workers' comp insurance? What kind of workers' comp benefits could they get?
They could get the exact same benefits they'd be entitled to if they did have insurance.
So if their employer had no insurance, they could still get the benefits they were entitled to receive?
Yes. The attorney would just have to know to bring the UEF on as a party in the action. One reason why you'd want an attorney involved.
Yeah, well, that's my next question. Let's say somebody's working for a roofing company. That seems like the companies that I always dealt with that didn't have workers' comp insurance. They fell off a roof. Their boss says he doesn't have workers' comp insurance. How does that guy get benefits? What would he do next?
Well, they'd have to file a claim. They have to make a first report of injury. But, of course, you don't have an insurance company to report that to in this case. A lot of times the employer is telling them they're telling them they've got the insurance, but maybe they've got only.
I'm going to pay for your medical bills when you're okay. I'll pay you $20 for being off work.
And I'll take care of those bills.
When I always heard that when I always have a client come in saying their boss said they would take care of their medical bills, my first thought was they don't have workers' comp insurance.
Right.
Now, there's a list, too, isn't there, of all the employers in the state of Kentucky that do and don't have workers' comp insurance?
Yes. There's a 1-800 number in Frankfort, 1-800-554-8601. Anyone in the state of Kentucky or anywhere who wanted to check on whether an employer has insurance could call that 1-800 number, and they could be connected with someone who could find out if a policy is in effect. Just like with car insurance, a business could go out and get workers' comp insurance, be able to have a certificate saying they have insurance, and then stop making payments. And then the policy lapses, and then suddenly they don't have insurance. But the employees wouldn't know that.
Yeah, but the state requires everybody that does have insurance to register that with the Department of Workers' Claims, right?
Correct.
Right, so they can call that number. What was that number again for them to find out?
1-800-554-8601. That is the workers' compensation specialist for the Department of Workers' Claims.
And you just ask them if my employer, you give them the name of the employer, and they look on the computer to see if they've got insurance.
They could either tell you, or they might have to connect it over to a different division, but it could still get answered from that phone.
Right.
Bottom line is you can make a phone call to find out if they're lying to you about insurance.
All the time. You call monthly to make sure they continue to have insurance.
Hey, Scott, what I'll do for the convenience of your listeners is I'll go ahead and put that number, that contact information in the show notes to this. So if you happen to be listening to this, you noticed a whole bunch of paragraphs right below the podcast player, those are called show notes, and I'll have in there that contact information, so you don't have to, if you didn't write it down, don't worry, you'll be able to find it relatively easily, and it'll be on the episode that'll be on Scott's website as well.
Yeah, it seems like once a month I'm talking to somebody that says they got hurt at work 3 months ago. Their boss says that they, don't turn this in, I'll go ahead and pay for your medical expenses because I don't want to have a claim. And then all of a sudden they don't pay for the medical expenses. They find out that the hospital visit's $5,000 and the MRI is $2,000, and all of a sudden they can't get a hold of the guy they were working for. And anytime I hear that scenario, my first thought is they're being lied to. This guy doesn't have workers' comp insurance. He's not trying to, not make a claim. He just doesn't have it. So if somebody has that happen to them, they need to call that number, right? Figure out if they've got it.
A real good way to do it would be to call the number, yes.
Okay. Now, once they figure out whether or not they've got workers' comp insurance, let's say they find out that they don't, okay? And you mentioned a minute ago about filing a first report of injury and maybe filing a claim. We're talking about going to the Department of Workers' Claims and filing a formal claim to get benefits, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Now, I've seen some people do that on their own, what we call pro se by themselves, but I think that's something that probably requires most people to have an attorney to do it. But even harder than that, you've got to bring the UEF, the Uninsured Employers Fund, in if they don't have a claim, correct?
Yes, if you want to get benefits paid.
So what essentially has to happen is their attorney has to do not only the formal claim, but they also have to do one more step, which is to bring the Uninsured Employers Fund in as a party, correct?
Yes.
Okay, and then that's when you show up, right?
Correct.
And then what would you do once you're there? What happens at the UEF?
Well, again, just a caveat.
You're retired, but it's still in your system.
I retired in 2019. They could have some different procedures in place now that I'm not aware of. But the procedure was, when I was still a practicing attorney for them, was we would receive a claim, and we'd start investigating the claim. Usually the UEF, when they got a case, the case has already been going on for a while. The majority of the time, I would say, the cases we had, we weren't brought in at the very beginning of the case. Usually it's active for a while, and then we would get brought in. So usually there's a thicker file involved. I'm not getting a case that's only got one page involved.
And let me ask you a question. And Scott, from the attorney standpoint, from the person who's representing the injured worker, is that because you're still trying to figure out if a policy exists, or kind of?
Sometimes, yeah. And there's other ways for insurance to apply besides the UEF. Sometimes there's a thing called up the ladder, where you're working for a subcontractor and there's a contractor there. What I like about the UEF is it's a guarantee that somebody's going to get their benefits.
No injured worker in the state should ever have to worry about getting benefits. They're either going to get it through an insurance company, or if there's not one existing, then the UEF should pay.
Now that still assumes that the case has merit, right? I
mean, you got to win your case, right? Yeah.
No, it has to be a just case, and not every situation is going to be that way. But yes, it has to be a truly legitimate case.
Yeah, I always get a little squeamish when I hear there's the word guarantee floating around. No, you still have to prove the case, but then the UEF will actually step into the shoes of the employer who should have been carrying insurance.
Or the insurance, step into the shoes of the insurance
company who, yeah.
Now, Pat, what kind of injured employees have you dealt with in the UEF? What kind of occupations have you seen? And are there more than other types of occupations that you see? For instance, I mentioned roofers before, but is there a specific type of occupation that you see maybe more than others?
The types of occupations that most commonly didn't have insurance, and there's a reason for it, were roofers and painters, coal mines.
Their insurance costs more.
Because their insurance costs a whole lot more.
Yeah.
What I was told years ago, maybe different today, was the cost of insurance was about $1 per dollar spent on salaries in high-risk businesses. I mean, if someone falls off the roof or at the top of a ladder, the cost of paying for those injuries are exorbitant. But if someone, if someone,
I've seen some of those bad injuries. Yeah.
If someone's working in an accounting office or just an office, then the cost of insurance is not that great, because the types of injuries you're likely to get, you're not as likely to get a wrecked back,
right?
Or someone is not as likely to die.
Right. A receptionist might get a cut finger from a paper cut. But
I was just going to levy that claim that I had a pretty severe paper cut a while back. I didn't know what to do.
I have seen bad paper cuts that get infected. Yeah. But I can understand that. But it also surprises me about the amount of benefits that you pay. You say you pay basically for everything. Off work benefits, TTD, what we call temporary total disability benefits.
Lost wages.
Okay, you pay medical expenses.
All medical expenses, and medical expenses for life in the state of Kentucky. If someone has a legitimate claim and wins their case, or it gets settled, then they're entitled to benefits for life. And that comes out of the UEF. The UEF had its own medical payment division. There were two ladies when I was still there that their responsibility was to make sure those benefits got paid every month.
Yeah, and what I've seen, too, is that sometimes it takes a while for somebody to get an attorney involved in their case because they've been misled by their employer that they got insurance, and then the attorney gets involved. They've been off work maybe for 6 to 9 months, and there's past due interest on benefits, too, that person should have received, not only the benefits but also past due interest. And UEF will also pay the past due interest, won't it?
That's correct.
And you mentioned something to me a minute ago, and this was actually something new to me, that in Kentucky, if an employer violates a safety regulation, the employee can receive an additional 30% increase in their benefits. And I did not think that the UEF paid for that, but you said that they do.
As of 2019, yes, the UEF was responsible for paying all benefits, including the safety violation.
So if your employer puts you up on a roof without protection device and you fall down, there's a 30% safety increase you actually get that from the UEF too.
Yes, assuming the judge has awarded that. Yes.
Correct. It all has to be done by the judge. Yeah.
So is it safe to say basically the UEF steps in and they basically mimic the same benefit structure and package that the normal workers' comp insurance carrier would provide? Is that
correct?
Okay, so it's basically a mirror. So at the end of the day, the employee doesn't really need to worry so much about, wow, is this going to get covered? As long as they have the ability to prove that case, and ideally that'd be through an attorney like Scott Scheynost,
or Pat Roth when he's in my office.
Right. Yeah, and Pat is currently there. So that's got to really let people sleep a little bit better at night, because I mean, if you've been severely injured, you've got a lot of pressure. You've got a lot of concerns going on right now. When you learn that, oh my gosh, my insurance isn't there because my employer lied to me or misled me.
Right.
It's good to know that you guys were there.
Right. And we've been around a long time, I think, at least since '87.
Yeah, I've actually had cases against UEF where we've reopened them before, where somebody had an injury and we settled the case or got a decision, and then later on they had to have another surgery, and we've reopened it and gotten additional benefits. And it just doesn't go away. Actually, I think the UEF handles cases better than a lot of the insurance companies.
A lot of times attorneys like working with our attorneys. Now, we, the lawyers in that office, we could be protective of the fund because we didn't want to pay claims that were meritless. So we had to protect the fund in that situation. But then in situations where it was pretty clear it was a legitimate injury and the employer did not have insurance, then there were just claims that had to be paid. So.
Well, not to get other people from the UEF that used to work there that are now retired mad at me, but I've actually had them fight cases all the way to the Supreme Court, where I wondered if they should go that far. But I've actually had cases from the UEF that have gone all the way up to the top, where they vigorously fought them even harder than some of the insurance carriers that pay top dollar for attorneys, to be honest with you. So my experience with the UEF is everybody's very professional. They vigorously defend them. And again, I've had cases go all the way to Supreme Court with them that we've had to win.
I've taken cases to the Supreme Court. A friend of mine told me once he Googled my name and some case that I'm listed as a losing attorney on came up in the auto search, and I always defended myself on that as I inherited that case from the guy who had lost it at 2 levels, who then retired, and it was one of the cases I inherited when I first went to work for the state.
Yeah, but my experience with the UF is everybody's very professional. They know what they're doing. This is all they do. You're not getting an attorney that may be doing, divorce work and securities regulation on the side, and just happens to fall into a workers' comp claim. Most of them have a lot of experience. Most of them are very professional, which means if they know, they got a case that they got to pay, they usually realize that. And they know if they got a case they don't have to pay, they realize that too, and they're going to fight over it. Right. But my experience with everybody at the UF has actually been pretty professional. And again, most of the time they've been vigorously defended. They don't roll over. They fight them pretty tough.
And this is what they do full time too.
Correct.
This is their job, and it was for the last 14 years of my state government work. It's what I did. So, there was no practicing other types of law while we were at work.
What would you recommend to somebody that got hurt at work and their boss doesn't have insurance? Workers' comp insurance, what would you recommend they do?
Well, they should contact an attorney about filing a claim at some point. If they've got a legitimate claim and they've got no way to pay for it, they're entitled to pick the doctor of their own choosing, but they may not know this at the beginning. So they've got to go find a workers' comp attorney to help guide through, because just like any government bureaucracy, there's lots of paperwork.
The only other thing about this I think people need to understand is that a lot of employers or a lot of businesses classify people as independent contractors, which means they don't have to pay for workers' comp insurance when these people are actually employees. And I've seen that a lot, where people were paid with 1099s and the employer says, you're an independent contractor. I don't have to have workers' comp insurance on you. You get hurt at work, that's your own thing. But in fact, a lot of times those people are actually employees underneath the law of Kentucky. Now, have you seen that happen where people were classified as 1099s, but they were actually employees?
That is probably the biggest amount of claims that the UEF received, were cases where the employer liked to classify their employees as subcontractors.
And there's a lot of reasons for that. First of all, you don't pay for workers' comp. Secondly, you don't take any taxes out of it. Third, you can just tell them to go away. You don't have to pay unemployment insurance.
Well, and here's the other thing, what I used to tell people, that under other divisions of the law, such as paying taxes, they may actually be legitimately subcontractors. But when it comes to work, once the person gets injured and they go see a lawyer, the lawyer's always going to guide them into the workers' comp system. And the last thing the lawyer wants to do in that case is to say they're an independent contractor, because there's no avenue.
And brushing off some old cobwebs here, I think that's Ratliff versus Ratliff, isn't it, that talks about the criteria for being an employee?
Yes, it is.
You remember any of that stuff off the top of your head?
No. I don't remember
basically
each of the criteria.
Yeah, it's like control of the person, how they're paid, if they're paid hourly, whether or not they're in a type of business that might be considered an employee. There's a couple of criteria that are like that I think people need to look at to determine whether or not they're an employee. And just because the boss, the owner of the business, says you're not an employee, you're an independent contractor, that is not always the law. It doesn't hurt to talk to somebody to find out a little bit more about it.
Right, and it doesn't mean they're lying either. The employer, like I said, for tax purposes, for other purposes, other parts of the law might legitimately classify them as subcontractors. But when it comes to workers' comp, the administrative law judges have the right to look at it in their own lens, and could easily determine that they were an employee and not a subcontractor.
A lot of government agencies sometimes have limits on what they can pay out for benefits. For instance, assigned claims plan, I think, for PIP insurance can only pay $10,000 out, and I think the uninsured employees, but the Kentucky Guarantee Fund has a cap on how much they have to pay for people that don't have actual insurance. But for the Uninsured Employers Fund, if you have a person that's been totaled that's going to get benefits for the rest of their life and might need full-time care in a nursing home, they will pay all of those benefits. Is that correct?
They absolutely will. I know at the time I retired, there were at least 2 or 3 old cases of people who had gotten severely injured at one point, and they're, back in the 80s, back in the 70s, and they were still paying benefits on them, still paying medical bills. We had a guy who was quadriplegic, and they had bought a van for him that was accessible for him.
Hundreds of thousands of dollars in benefits, at least.
I can't even imagine how much, but it would have to be in that figure.
So there's actually no limit then on what they would have to pay?
Not that I'm aware of. Nothing comes to mind.
Mm-hmm. And getting back to some of the cases you've seen before, what were some of the kind of injured workers that you see? What occupations had you seen?
Oh, the types of occupation?
Yeah.
Oh, obviously roofers and painters, and a lot of times it's backs and leg injuries.
Back's a common workers' comp injury, seems like, yeah.
Right.
But I mean, the occupation itself, like a dog groomer. I had one person that was at a gymnast instructor.
Oh, it could be a truck delivery. A truck driver's obviously things happen a lot on the road. And
I guess it could be an accident involving a car with a third party involved, and still be a UEF case too.
Absolutely. And another thing to keep in mind is a guy or a woman who works for a company who just happens to be traveling through the state of Kentucky. They have no connection to the state of Kentucky at all, except they're traveling. If they get injured in the state of Kentucky, the Kentucky law allows them to file a claim, even if their employer doesn't have insurance in the state of Kentucky. And has no connection outside of their employee traveling through. They have the right to file a Kentucky claim.
Yeah. So I was actually amazed at how that worked when I first started practicing workers' comp a long time ago. And what I also found out is some other states don't have this benefit. For instance, I've admitted to practice in Indiana, and Indiana does not have this statutory scheme, which I think is horrendous to people that get hurt over there. You essentially have to sue your employer outside of workers' compensation, which if your employer doesn't have any money, you don't get anything. Here you've got an unlimited fund that can pay for your benefits that you might be entitled to.
That's right. And I don't know how many states have the equivalent of it.
Do you know how this is funded, where the money comes from for the Uninsured Employers Fund?
Every business in the state of Kentucky is taxed. There's I don't even know what it's called, but there's a tax that they pay into. And the UEF and some other agencies are funded. The whole workers' comp system is funded through that tax. And all of the Labor Cabinet's workers' comp division is paid for. The judges are paid for. Everything is paid for through that fund, through that tax.
Well, we're going down another road here. What were probably some of the more interesting cases you had in UEF?
Well, I know I mentioned beforehand, I had a case. It was a sad case in around E-Town a few years ago that a guy was working at a cherry picker. He was trimming trees, and he was up high, but the allegation was, and apparently he'd been smoking marijuana, something. He had that in his system. He gets in a cherry picker and doesn't use a harness. Now, the question was raised was, did the employer require him to use the harness or not? The employer eventually prevailed. The employee's attorney eventually prevailed on that, and the employer had testified that he'd always made the equipment available, but this guy chose not to use them, and the employer didn't force him to use it. But he got the bucket that he was standing in got caught on a limb one time, and when he freed it, then he got catapulted out of the bucket. And
catastrophic
he got
injuries.
Killed. Yes.
Yeah, it's horrible.
Wow.
And
it's horrible. Any other big cases like that you can think of?
Well, that one's pretty bad. Obviously.
That's bad.
I mean, that's a workplace fatality.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this. I know in the normal Kentucky workers' compensation system, there is a death benefit, a lump sum death benefit for the employee who it goes, I guess, to the estate upon the death and once it's adjudicated. But does the UEF have that same provision as well? I know we said it mirrored, but is there a death benefit as well?
Yes, it's a workers' comp death benefit, so it doesn't matter. Either the insurance company or the UEF is required to pay. It was $72,000 or $77,000 at the time I
it changes
retired.
every year.
Yeah, it goes up every year.
And that's in addition to what the spouse and potentially the dependent children, the minor dependent children, could also receive.
Correct.
So I mean, again, it's a mirror of the Kentucky program, the Kentucky workers' comp system.
There's another aspect to the UEF that insurance company doesn't have. Because it's a state agency, then the UEF has the right to go after the employer who failed to get the insurance to try to recoup it. And I don't know what percentage of money they're able to recoup, but they do have the right. Like if a painter hasn't incorporated, then the UEF could go ahead and immediately, before final adjudication, could place a lien on that person. And if he owns a home, that lien goes right to the house.
Because it basically covers everything at that point, doesn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. Wow.
Bottom line is they need insurance.
Yeah. Yeah. Pay the insurance. I mean, if you have employees, even part-time, in the state of Kentucky, or you're doing business in the state of Kentucky, pay your insurance.
Just buy the insurance, yes.
I think so. Scott, you have any further thoughts about the UEF or just the workers' compensation claims that might involve this?
Well, again, the UEF, I think a lot of people don't realize that they provide an avenue that pays for your benefits despite the fact that your employer doesn't have insurance. A lot of states don't have this, and you may not have it in Indiana or Tennessee. I don't know, North Carolina, but in Kentucky you got this avenue that's available for you. And also, when your boss says, don't turn this in, I'll pay for your medical treatment, your health treatment. To me, that's always a red flag. And at that point, if I was the injured worker, I'd be really checking out whether or not they have insurance. I don't think most employers understand what it costs to go to the hospital anymore. And when they get their first bill, they're usually not going to pay it. And I've had people not be able to find the employer for several months. So Pat gave us a number to call. What was that number again?
1-800-554-8601.
Okay.
It's the Department of Workers' Claim, the Workers' Compensation Specialist Division.
Yeah, you can find out in a phone call in 30 seconds whether or not they're lying to you.
And Scott, let me ask you this. If I'm listening to this, and I'm an injured worker, and I've been listening going, I've got a few questions, and they wanted to speak with you directly, what would be the easiest way for them to get in touch with you?
The easiest way is to call my office at 502-937-5287. You can also send me an email at sscheynost@scheynostlaww.com. I'll be happy to talk to you. I'll be happy to let you talk to Pat when he's in the office, who knows a lot more about this than me. But we're happy to talk to you about these things. We handle these on a contingency fee basis, which means we don't charge you anything unless we recover benefits for you, so it's a free call. And again, I feel like I'm pretty lucky because I got years of experience with UEF in my office now with Pat, and I hope you call so I can put him to work on it.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And Scott, as an attorney here in Kentucky, when we start talking about contingency fee, basically you don't charge an hourly rate. You're betting that if you take that case, that you're going to get paid out of whatever settlement or award is made, and your fees actually are capped. But the Kentucky Bar Association requires us to state that the court costs and case expenses are typically the responsibility of the client. How do you handle that within your office?
Yeah, what we normally do is if there are expenses involved in the case, we will normally forward those costs during the case.
And so you'll pay them up front.
Exactly,
right?
yeah. forward. And at the end of the case, when we resolve the case, then we will deduct those out of the recovery. So in addition to our fee, there are expenses that might be incurred too, and expenses vary from case to case and the complexity of them. But those are the two main charges that somebody's going to incur in a workers' compensation if they pursue it with us.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And if you guys didn't catch Scott's email address, the easiest way to do that is if you go to his website, which is ScheynostLaw.com, there's a contact us form, and that's an easy way, a secure way for you just to go ahead and fill out your question there, and those will go directly to Scott. And once again, the last name is spelled SCHEYNOSTLAW.com. Pretty simple. So, first of all, Pat, I know you're busy. I appreciate you taking time off today. It's a beautiful day outside, yet you're in the studio here talking about workers' compensation and the UEF. So thank you very much for your time. It's been a pleasure meeting you. And Scott, as always, buddy, I know how busy you are. It's great to see you again, and I hope you're doing well. Hope your Derby turned out well. Not to date the episode, but we're coming off the backside of Derby week here.
I did not have the winner, but I'm still a happy guy.
There you go. And friends, we'll be back in a couple of weeks, so thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you soon. Remember, if you're hurt at work, one of the guys you may want to call is Scott Scheynost right here in Louisville, Kentucky. Until next time, take care. Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to this episode of Hurt at Work. Scott will be back in 2 weeks with a new episode. For more information, be sure to visit ScheynostLaw.com. That's SCHEYNOST Law.com. You can also follow Scott's Workers' Comp office on Facebook. Until next time, be safe and remember, Scott's ready to help, especially when you and your family need it the most.